Hello, my name is John Smithin, and I'm the executive co-director of the Aurora Philosophy Institute here in Aurora, Ontario, Canada. With me again today is Ronen Grunberg, who's the Vice President Technology of the Aurora Philosophy Institute and was the original founder of the long-running Tuesday Philosophy Club here in Aurora. So, Ronan, I think we have to start today by mentioning this vexed notion of the philosophical order again. That means, obviously, that we're supposed to deal with the different branches of philosophy in a specific order. I recall, for example, Alamachenko's universal philosophical system. Well, the short version says that the order should be metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, politics. In this discussion, I think we're going to be dealing specifically with metaphysics, and we will talk now about metaphysical realism. Metaphysical realism, or what we've sometimes called realism per totam viam, and not with the critical realism that we discussed at some length last time.
Right. So yes, metaphysics, John, as you're hinting at, is absolutely foundational to knowledge. And as people probably already know, metaphysics is about probing the nature of reality and trying to understand what it is. And metaphysical realism, which we're going to be talking about today, basically asserts an independent and objective reality. And the idea here is that we can actually know this reality and that we can have an epistemology arise from it. And I think that's the nature of what we're going to be talking today.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So I think the argument about metaphysics in general is that it's impossible to have a coherent view about the other things. It's impossible to have a coherent view about epistemology, ethics, politics, and so on, until a decision has been made about one's basic metaphysical commitments. And by contrast, modern philosophy, remember, modern philosophy goes back 300 years, and postmodern philosophy have abandoned metaphysics and what they call foundationalism. You use that word, foundation, right? They've abandoned foundationalism and to some extent just seem to go around in circles, discussing epistemological issues. What do the words that we use really mean? How can we be sure that we know what we know, etc., etc., etc.? And, much philosophical discussion seems to be exactly like that. I mean, for example, our last two discussions were precisely along those lines. So what I would like to do now is to try to give two concrete examples of what I mean when I say that metaphysics makes all the difference. So let's, for the sake of argument, put up two alternative scenarios. Suppose, for example, that one's basic metaphysical commitment is that there is a supernatural deity, that there is a God, a supernatural God, right? Well, then, by definition, then, your relevant epistemology must be divine revelation. You just read the good book, whichever good book you happen to subscribe to, and that's it. That's all you basically need to know, right? Ethics is no problem. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, you would have the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt not do this. Thou shalt not do... By the way, it's typically thou shalt not. Have you noticed that? It's things that you can't do.
Not fun.
Yeah, no, it's no fun.
Right.
And then logically, your politics is very, very simple. It should be a theocracy of some kind. Or at the very least, the kings should rule by divine right. That it's decided. That's obviously what it should be. Right? On the other hand, suppose that all you think is that there's just nature. No, I don't mean nature as a spirit or anything like that. I mean just the natural world. The laws of physics, the laws of biology, whatever, right? Well, if that's the world that you live in, no supernatural elements, then the only way you can know things is by the scientific method. You have to do your experiments, etc., etc., right? See how it works. What ethics would that lead to? Well, it would probably lead back to something like Aristotle's virtue ethics. Not thou shalt not do this, not that thou shalt do whatever is virtuous, which means, again, not the conventional meaning of virtue, it means doing whatever is good for human flourishing. So that all of philosophy, all of the special sciences, the purpose of doing it is so that humans can, quote, flourish. And, then what would be the politics which emerge out of that? Well, again, would be Aristotle's term. The politics which would emerge out of that is a polity in some sense. A sort of constitutional type thing where everyone has their say, everyone has their voice. It does not mean a democracy. Aristotle would think that a democracy is a degenerate form for the obvious reasons. It's a tyranny of the majority. If 51% of the people vote that you should walk backwards on Wednesdays, you walk backwards on Wednesdays, and there you are, right? It doesn't allow for minority rights in the slightest. There we are. Do you think that those? They're obviously stark examples, but do you think that illustrates the difference that metaphysics makes?
Right. So the tyranny of the majority, we're not going to get into that, although it is an interesting discussion potentially. But the notion of metaphysics, which is what we're talking about, and the fact that in a modern context, in postmodern context, there is a move away from metaphysics. I think that is an interesting idea. Foundationalism is very important, and there has been a focus, as we know, by way of the scientific method, to an epistemological approach. And it does lead to, some, I think, misunderstandings. And, often I don't think the right questions are asked vis-a-vis metaphysics. But if I can just say, one of the things I do think is that sometimes some of the questions that are asked that may seem circular reflect an acknowledgement of the nuanced nature of understanding, in my opinion. Yeah. And embracing uncertainty is about really acknowledging the fact that sometimes philosophy and knowledge is context dependent. Truth is context dependent. So the evolution in thought that we sometimes see, which can be muddled on occasion. And so I agree with you for the most part, but I think that sometimes we need to leave the door open because we need to recognize the limitations of dogmatic certainty and encourage a nuanced exploration of meaning and knowledge in a diverse world.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. A key thing that I would argue, or would like to argue, is that metaphysics itself cannot be approached by the methods of epistemology, the theory of knowledge. And you often hear it said that the work of some scientists, the work of Bacon, Newton, Darwin, Freud, Einstein, all those, changed the world in some sense. But in a sense, that can't be true, can it? Because all that the scientists are doing is coming up with hypotheses about the way that the world works. They might turn out to be right, they might turn out to be wrong. But as for the world itself, and I mean here in the sense of the basic laws of physics, the basic laws of biology, and for that matter, the basic laws of psychology viewed as a science, right? They just go on being what they always were, right? So in metaphysics, the argument is often made that there has to be an axiomatic approach. And and I'm going to ask you what you think about that in a minute. I'd just like to take the definition of an axiom from the Oxford Philosophical Dictionary edited by Professor Blackburn. An axiom is a proposition from which we may begin an assertion that is taken as fundamental. And axioms are not subject to proof. They're supposed to be self-evident. An axiom is self-evident, but conversation or discussion, even the discussion that we're having right now, cannot proceed without them. It just becomes meaningless. And therefore, all subsequent proofs ultimately depend on these axioms. All subsequent proofs in epistemology ultimately depend on the axioms. What do you think about that?
Okay, so let me just begin by saying that I agree that axioms are fundamental principles. So I think that is generally true. And, they are assumptions in a system of thought, and they are considered self-evident. I don't think any philosopher, be that philosopher a critical realist or a metaphysical realist, an idealist, doesn't matter. Any philosopher would agree with that basic notion. And it is important to know your axioms, because they do serve as a starting point for logical reasoning, and they provide the foundational framework on which other propositions and theorems and ideas can be built on. So I agree with that. I think we're in agreement there. However, what I would say is that sometimes what is considered self-evident can vary between different philosophical or mathematical frameworks. So while axioms are essential for constructing coherent and meaningful systems of thought, their acceptance often relies on intuition. You probably would agree with that. To some extent, you intuit that they are true, or some kind of a consensus within an intellectual tradition.
It's interesting you say intuit. Yes, you remember when we were talking last time about intuition, right? The question was, where does the intuition come from? Does it come as a bolt in the blue from your supernatural deity that all is revealed, right? Or does it come from the hard work that you yourself have done previously? That's a deep question.
That is it's an interesting question. And that may be a question for another video, but it's an interesting question for sure. So let's be specific. It's often said then that the three basic axioms of reality, the things that are supposed to be self-evident, are this. The first of all is existence itself. And you often see phrases like existence exists. There is something rather than nothing. If there was nothing, what would be? We wouldn't be here. So. The next thing is identity. Something can't be one thing and another thing at the same time. So often, again, in the literature, you often say things like just, putting it in symbols, A is A is not A, right?
And so forth.
Right.
And then the third one is that consciousness is a property of living beings. For example, humans, but of course not exclusively humans, right? And that view is called biological naturalism. So what's being suggested, I think, is that consciousness has a biological function. And a realist would say that that's a problem for idealists, because even idealists must accept this axiom. They must 100%, they do accept this axiom, like it or not, because to engage in argument at all, they must be conscious themselves. And they must be, if there's any point in argument, they must be assuming that the other person is conscious. Kind of solipsism is kind of automatically ruled out, right, in some way, right?
Yeah.
And one way I like to put it, to use these philosophical slogans, it is not a question of I think, therefore I am, right? Which is Descartes' thing. Rather, it's I am, therefore I think. Like you wouldn't be thinking at all unless you already existed. I am, therefore I think. What do you think? What do you think?
Okay, so let me just very quickly say that you argued that you need to be conscious in order to argue anything. I've had arguments with people that I wonder whether they're conscious. So that's just a side point, okay?
Good point.
But let me just say that, yes, biological naturalism does assert consciousness is a biological function. Okay, so it emerges from biology. I would say, though, that if you're an idealist, you might think that this is a bit reductionist, and they would challenge this strict biological naturalism. Idealists might argue that consciousness is something broader. And that we can understand what it is beyond biology. I mean, this is something that they do argue. I know you don't agree with this, but this is something that they do argue. And I'm not sure, because I'm a little bit uncertain myself on this yet. But idealists might, I think, question that we must accept the biological axiom and say that it maybe oversimplifies a more diverse perspective. I do think, and I have to say, that the nature of consciousness remains a complex and debated philosophical topic. I know you don't agree with this, and we're going to go with your perspective, but that is true, I think, of consciousness.
Again, I think the argument is this: is that in order to argue against, consciousness being a biological phenomena, as you just said that some people do, you must actually be assuming it. By mere virtue of carrying out the argument, you're relying on it in some sense.
I do agree, and I think we don't have to get. I mean, it's just I'm making the point, but
no, it's not a debate we should get into.
No, we're not going to get it. But I do agree with you that for the most part, we know that in order to have consciousness, you have to have a biological basis. I have not seen consciousness in anything other than a biological thing. So I would agree with you on that.
And so, okay, we've set down the axioms, right? But what are the implications of those axioms? What are we committing to when we say that such and such a thing is self-evident? Again, the argument is that identity, take the first one first, identity implies causality. I think that needs some unpacking, right? The next one, we just touched on it, is that existence must have primacy over consciousness, because one first needs to exist in order to have consciousness. And then the third one, which again introduces another sort of jargon term, is that the metaphysically given is the absolute.
Right.
So, Ronen, would you like to explain these things or explain these arguments? I don't know if you agree with them or not.
Yeah, for the most part, I do, and it's quite a bit to unpack. So, let's just start with the notion of identity. So, in essence, when you say that something has a given identity, what you're arguing that things are themselves. They can't be anything than what they are. So, A is A, B is B, and B is not A. You're John, I'm Ronen, I'm not John.
But remember, Alan introduced a hybrid thing called a Ronen.
Okay, that's true.
So she was not obeying the laws of causality. Right?
Yeah, that's an in joke, but yeah, you're right. But the point that needs to be added to this is that
But the thing is, in reality, we are discrete. We're not Ronen.
That's right. I'm Ronen.
No, we're not Jonan. We're not Jonan.
We're not Jonan.
There's two discrete things.
That's
There's Ronen here, John here.
That is true.
Never the twain shall meet, kind of thing.
Only in movies can we have a Jonan. Exactly. Only in fantasy it's possible to have that. But A is A, B is B, and any change in those things must come from some external force. There has to be an external causal force to make a change in those things. Now, causality is an interesting idea, and causality is related to the notion of infinite regress. So if we talk about, we came here by way of cause. Well, what caused the thing that caused us? And so on.
Big issue.
It just goes on ad infinitum. And what we are kind of forced to come to is some original cause. And in philosophy, the original cause has sometimes been attributed to a prime mover. There's some prime mover that starts it all. There are real problems with this this argument. So one typical solution to the infinite regress idea is to assert that there is some kind of a supernatural consciousness like God that sets the initial cause. That is the initial cause, the prime mover. Now, there's another possibility, right, which I think you are more into, which is the realist alternative, that basically existence itself is the primary cause. And I think that jives with the notion of metaphysical realism. So it's the primacy of existence, and existence is where we can come to understand causality. So this is the realist principle, the primacy of existence. Things exist independently of consciousness, and so on and so forth. I'm just reminded of I was reading a book on genetics at one time, right? And it's describing how the gene sequence goes and how genes get passed on, all that kind of thing, which I'm not sure I fully understand.
But he ran into this same problem. And I thought, what starts, which comes first,
Right.
chicken or egg? And he said, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to postulate something called a gene organizing device.
Okay.
Oh, God.
Right.
Sure, right?
Right.
I thought that was great.
Okay.
Yeah. So we discussed the primacy over consciousness. I think we should talk about the third implication as well, right? About the metaphysically given, being absolute. That's the third of these. This third of these implications. And I would say that the metaphysically given should be taken to mean physical reality in the sense of various laws of nature,
Right.
Physics, chemistry, biology, and so forth. Also, it's much better to think of it as a process, including change. We can't just get stuck into having an inventory of unchanging things. But yeah, so the metaphysically given is that the laws of nature. Things can move on. To me, that sort of has echoes of ancient debates way back in philosophy.
Yes, this is not new.
Yeah.
This has been discussed ever since the pre-Socratics, and the two names that come to mind are Parmenides, or Parmenides, if you want to call him that, and Heraclides, right? So this is a big topic, but let me just give a very brief overview. So Heraclides basically argued that the only thing that we have is change. Everything is in a constant state of flux and change, and everything that exists is physical. So he was very much into a material reality, and he embraced flux. And the Heraclitean approach very much is in line with metaphysical realism. Okay. Now, in contrast to that is Parmenides. Parmenides argued the notion that there is a singular and unchanging reality. It doesn't change. It just is. When we see something changing, we are essentially experiencing an illusion. It's not really changing.
Oh, that's great. So I've got hair after all then.
That's right. If you want to look at it that way.
Yeah.
None of us are changing. None of us are getting older. None of us are going to get younger, but they're not getting older.
We should have a Parmenides association, right?
Now, I know it sounds silly, but one of the things that, we can't just throw Parmenides out as being silly, because he actually made some fairly interesting argument on his ideas, and he did, I think, put forward the notion of a static unity, and he said, this notion of change is one that gets in the way of knowledge, because as soon as we think we know something, it's something else. Well, how do we know things then? So I would just end this little thing by saying that the notion of change is much more compatible with metaphysical realism.
Yes, yeah. Now, there's another problem, though, because on the other hand, we've argued a few times that social relations are themselves real, okay? But obviously, they're not metaphysically given, so they're not absolute.
Sure.
They're real, but they're not the metaphysically given. The social world is real and has causal effects, but is not the absolute. It can be changed by human intervention, not always for the better. So social science, for example, is a special case. And, going back to this notion, we talk about metaphysical realism, I think it's a real criticism of the people who describe themselves as metaphysical realists, that they haven't adequately dealt with this concept of social reality.
It is a complicated thing. Social reality is always a bit of an enigma, because it really stands apart. It's not material, but it's not idealism either. It's not some transcendental thing, but it is real, but it's not it's not a material thing.
Yeah. So I think, to deal with this, there's a couple of things. But first of all, we need to take up again an issue which we've mentioned before on a few occasions, which is in the philosophy textbooks, what you normally see posited as opposites are idealism on the one hand and materialism on the other. The opposites are not usually given as idealism versus realism. right?
Right. That's true. That is true.
But this seems to be a false dichotomy, going back to our axioms, because both idealism and materialism entail rejecting the axioms in one way or another. Idealism, you said before, idealism rejects the primacy of existence, and materialism doesn't reject the primacy of consciousness. It rejects the whole notion of consciousness, altogether. Is there any way out of that argument?
No, I think you make a good point. That materialism is very reductionistic and has to be false because we do know that consciousness exists, although there are some materialists who would argue that, consciousness doesn't even exist. And that is clearly wrong. A realist doesn't deny consciousness. A realist says consciousness exists, but it's biologically emergent. So philosophy books often present idealism and materialism as opposites, but they neglect realism. And I think this is your point
because there are some things which are real but not material.
It's right. And I agree with that. I think we agree on that point. Both idealism and materialism involve rejecting certain axioms. Idealism challenges the primacy of existence, which you would question. Materialism questions the nature of consciousness, which again you would question. So what is the resolution? Well, the resolution is realism. Realism offers a more nuanced perspective that balances the primacy of existence and the role of consciousness. And I
think that's a good way of putting it, actually.
And so this approach allows for a more comprehensive understanding of philosophical viewpoints.
So I think we should try to talk, actually, about some of the differences between what are called between the social facts and what philosophers following Anscombe actually have usually called the brute facts, the physical facts, right? So brute facts are both ontologically and epistemologically objective. So once again, we're using our big words. If they're ontologically objective, like a physical fact, it's what you said, it exists regardless of whether anyone's in the room to see it. But they're also held to be epistemologically objective in the sense that you can use the scientific method and you do your experiments or whatever it is. Okay, as compared to that, social facts are irreducibly ontologically subjective, which means that, King Charles III is the King of Canada. And you and I, agree that King Charles III is the King of Canada. That's a social fact. Whether we like the King or support the King or whether we're monarchists, that's a social institution and it exists by virtue of the fact that we accept it as such. If we say, oh, no, we don't want, there's no such thing as a king, right? The whole social fact, people didn't bow to the king or whatever. It would just, I'm not suggesting people shouldn't bow. But if they didn't bow to the king, the whole thing would collapse. I don't think it has to be a group mind. It doesn't have to, like it can be ontologically subjective. It'd still be methodologically individualistic. It doesn't have to be a group mind. I mean, it's in your mind and it's in my mind at the same time.
That's a big one. It's an interesting one.
Do we need to unpack a little bit those things? Or?
No, I mean, I agree with you. I think that ontological subjective and still being real is essentially something that relies on some collective intentionality, which we see in a social context. No one would argue that there are things that are not physically real, but are still ontologically real. They are objective in the sense that they exist, and they're part of our, physical reality in the sense that they are there. Brute facts and social facts are real. There's no getting around that. They're both real. They're both very real, even though social facts are a different real than brute facts. And they both have, and this is key, I think, to what you're trying to argue, they both have an impact, a causal impact on the physical and social realms. They can change things.
Yes. Yeah. you see, at the end of the day, it seems to me that it's probably much easier to grasp the notion of metaphysical realism in the case of the brute facts rather than the social facts.
Sure,
But
I agree with that.
that's why there's much more debate about the social sciences probably than the physical sciences. But if social facts are epistemologically objective, which means that we can know about them, even if ontologically subjective, well, there can be a valid social science. Knowledge in the field rather than mere opinion. And to go back to the thing we're saying, it's possible at least to aspire to the truth, even if we may not achieve the truth in any particular investigation. And to go back to what we were talking about last time, the method to be used is so-called abduction or retroduction, and not deduction or not deduction or induction. So the method should be abduction or quote retroduction, not the standard deduction versus induction.
Right.
So would you like to elaborate on that? We mentioned it, last time.
Sure. Well, abduction and retroduction is an interesting idea. I don't think it's as well known as induction and deduction. So deduction, as I'm sure most people know, is a traditional way to reason. And in deduction, we reason from general principles to specific instances. And induction is the opposite. It's drawing general conclusions from specific observations. Now, abduction and retroduction is essentially trying to craft the best explanation based on your observed phenomena. So you observe something in the past, and you simply try to explain what it is, right? So with abduction and retroduction, so going back, you basically are trying to figure out the complexity of the world and give answers as to what happened. But unlike induction and deduction, you're not trying to predict necessarily. It's not a predictive type of approach. Now, I may not get this. I may not have this completely right, but
well, it's like our detective mysteries that we talked about last time.
Yeah.
Like the model of the scientist should be the detective. Coming back to the scene of the crime. And trying to work it all out.
Exactly.
Not doing statistics and not that kind of.
I would just say that it basically considers context.
Yeah.
So retroduction and abduction considers context and multiple hypotheses, and tries to get a more nuanced understanding of what happened.
Yeah.
I think Sherlock Holmes is a little bit like that.
Yeah.
He's not trying to predict the future, but he's trying to figure out what happened.
Contrary to what Conan Doyle said, he doesn't use deduction.
Yeah, that's true.
He uses
abduction, retroduction.
But we'll forgive Conan Doyle that. I think he just had a medical degree.
It's really well suited to situations where several explanations could fit observed data.
Exactly, which is exactly the detective thing.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. You try to narrow it down to the real truth.
But Ronen, here's the thing. We talked about that detective last time, in the context of Bernard Lonergan, who's a critical realist. So at the end of the day, are we any closer to deciding between metaphysical realism and critical realism?
Well, I think they both have their place. I would say that metaphysical realism is simpler. It's simpler in the sense that it's not, there are multi-layers, ontological layers, and I think this is an Achilles heel for critical realists. That it's complex.
Yes.
And metaphysical realism says, okay, it's not that complicated.
Yes.
It's fairly simple. So metaphysical realism is a more clear, less ambiguous. So it's unambiguous, and it really says there is a reality out there that we can know. It's as simple as that.
Yeah. At the end of the day,
So there is an ongoing, I think, thing about which one we should choose: metaphysical realism, critical realism. I think it depends. It depends. For the most part, metaphysical realism, I think, is easier to comprehend and probably easier to use.
Yeah. Well, we seem to have done metaphysics to death by now, right? Also, I would say that we do have a reasonably good handle on epistemology as well. We just discussed abduction, retroduction, and we did discuss this in much more length in the last couple of episodes. Moreover, obviously epistemology itself has actually been the main topic in philosophy for 300 years or more. Right. So in this year, this is 2004. This is our first episode of 2004.
No, 2024.
Oh, you're quite right.
2004. So you're living in the past.
Yeah, my mind, is just. We've once again questioned the whole notion of consciousness. Let's be clear about it. So this year, 2024, right? We should probably move on to ethics and politics.
Let's do
next time.
Absolutely.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you very much.
Take care. Bye-bye.